Welcome to Rally the Cause, a podcast where we learn from top leaders and marketing experts in the nonprofit world. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, everyone. This is Jeff Brum. I'm the host of the Rally the Cause podcast, where I talk to top leaders and experts in the marketing world, in the nonprofit space, and in fundraising. This episode is brought to you by Ignite. Ignite is a full-service digital agency focused on branding, campaigns, and marketing for nonprofits and purpose-driven organizations. At Ignite, we're both strategists and storytellers at heart. We partner with nonprofits that have big ideas and bold visions for the future. So if you think that we can help your organization, go to igniteaction.co or email jeff@igniteaction.co to get in touch with us to see how we can help. Today, I'm really pleased that we have Stephanie Schwartz joining us. She is the founder of the Little Bean Group, a full-service fundraising consulting firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. Stephanie has a passion for relationship building and creating connections. She's honed these skills over the years by working with two of Washington's best-known organizations and institutions, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, also known as AIPAC, and the George Washington University. Stephanie rose through the ranks from frontline fundraiser to executive leader while raising millions of dollars for these organizations from hundreds of donors across the country. And specifically at GW, she served as the chief of staff of the Division of Development and Alumni Relations, which was responsible for running the daily operations of a 200-person team charged with the ambitious fundraising goal, including a historic $1 billion campaign. Very exciting. Stephanie launched Little Bean Group in 2019 because she identified a clear need in the market for her area of expertise. And today she works with a variety of organizations, institutions, and schools in Washington, D.C. and beyond. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So the first thing I want to ask you, you've been in the fundraising world for a while now. And when an organization comes to you and says they need help with their fundraising, like something's off, where do you even start? Like, how do you even assess the situation?
So it's a good question. And it's one of the things I like to do the most, actually, assessments. And I start out first by, as you just said, Jeff, first building relationships with the organizational staff and trying to get a sense from them through conversation of what they think isn't working and also asking them what it is they want to achieve, both in terms of fundraising goals and metrics, but also the outcome that they want to see from their work. I find that sometimes what people think they need and what they actually are doing are not necessarily aligned. And so I try to work with them to figure out how much money do you actually need in order to fund your work and create the impact that you want to see. And so that comes from conversation, data review. Oftentimes I engage in conversation with donors and key stakeholders, trying to get a sense of the landscape. And then I dig a little deeper, as I mentioned, looking at data, looking at staff metrics and productivity, and ultimately putting forth recommendations for how to improve fundraising.
Got it. So once you've done that assessment, what's the general process look like? So you've done the assessment, you've figured out, okay, here's a set of recommendations. Do you typically just, share that with the organization and let their team kind of access it and move forward with it? Or what does a typical process look like for you?
Yeah, so it depends on what the client is interested in. Some people just want to get a sense of what's not working, and then they want to hire some new staff to come in and they want to have a report that shows some of both the challenges and also the opportunities in terms of their fundraising. And other clients want a really hands-on approach to fixing the issues and also leveraging the opportunities. So sometimes I'm involved in helping to build up a new staff for an organization of fundraising staff, drafting job organizations, participating in the interview process. I'm working with a client now where they know that their fundraising is not running on all cylinders. And so I'm really doing a holistic review of everything that they could possibly do to raise more money and then helping them to implement that. So it really just depends on what they're interested in.
Got it. And, we talked about before the recording how COVID has really, changed fundraising. Has it changed major gift fundraising? I know that you focus on major gifts for the most part, or maybe not. Like, what are your thoughts on what COVID has done kind of in your world?
I think COVID has really highlighted the need for having real, deep, authentic relationships with donors, because in the last year, you haven't been able to see them at routine events and gatherings that an organization or institution might hold, and have really had to rely, obviously, on virtual communication. I think in some ways, the last year has been a huge opportunity for major gift fundraising, because when you think about major gifts, it tends to be, those are gifts that really move an organization's needle forward. So big gifts, however an organization defines that. So for an organization, that could be gifts of 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, or 25,000. It just depends on the size. And so people who can give it that capacity, those donors typically are busy. They travel a lot. They often have other commitments, philanthropic and family. And a lot of that has slowed down this past year for people, right? People mostly have not been traveling for work. And I think that people have had more availability than ever before to meet virtually with gift officers and build relationships. And I know many organizations where the gift officers have just been on Zoom and other platforms most of the day talking to people, which I think is a huge opportunity that hasn't existed in the past. So I think that's a very positive aspect that's come out of COVID, that I think organizations that have been able to pivot and train their staff to work effectively with donors and prospects virtually really have, I think, both secured gifts and also been able to populate their major gift pipeline. I think for organizations that are where their fundraising is more transactional, either through direct mail, even some digital fundraising, and also event-based fundraising, that has not necessarily been as successful. And I think many organizations have been rethinking how they fundraise through those platforms, particularly through events.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I know you're not a big fan of event-based fundraising. Why is that? And, what should organizations be thinking about, like you said, who are maybe in the past have been, really focused on events to drive their fundraising?
So my general feeling about event-based fundraising in the major gift space is that it's not sustainable. It's really hard year after year to honor someone, to continue the practice of board members and other donors reaching out to their networks to get people to come to an event and make a gift. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of staff time. And I often think that staff time could be better spent just building relationships with donors and prospects and soliciting them, or working effectively with a board or a fundraising committee to facilitate their relationship building with donors and prospects. Event-based fundraising, particularly at the major gift level, I think also can yield varying results from year to year. So, right, if there's a model where you're honoring someone, so a lot of people may come in a particular year to make a gift in support of that person, but then they disappear because they don't actually have a relationship with the organization. They just have a relationship with the person, and the donor attrition rate, so the number of donors who drop off year to year, is really high in that model. And I think generally it's extremely time consuming, and it doesn't necessarily, it might hit the fundraising goal year to year, but it doesn't create a sustainable fundraising program where there are donors who feel an affinity to the organization, its mission, and also have a relationship with existing donors, board members, and staff.
Yeah. And I see that a lot. And I think, what's interesting is that when you come across an organization that in the past has been so focused on events, and now they're forced due to COVID to kind of rethink that. It gets them back to almost like the roots, right? Like the foundation of fundraising, which is based on building deep relationships, as you mentioned. So I have a thought about, it's interesting when you say, you talk a lot about deepening or creating relationships with donors. Do you ever come across where like the relationship building isn't necessarily the issue, but like what the organization is putting out there, or like their story just isn't resonating anymore? And what do you do about that? So like, you can build great relationships, but if the organization doesn't have a product that's, where there's a real need out in the world, or the product is kind of dated, or, what they're doing is not really clear, that I imagine that becomes an issue, right? Like, so how do you solve for that?
So I think if you have the relationships with donors, they will share that with you. It will either be through direct conversation, or you will see that longtime donors, that their giving starts to decrease or tails off or stops completely. And it might not be overnight, but you could see trends and patterns in data. That's never a good thing if you're having trouble reaching longtime donors. And I generally think, and you would also probably have a hard time accessing new donors. And I think and digital is such an, as you know, Jeff, is such an important part of, particularly in COVID, of finding new donors. And so if your messaging and the work that you're doing doesn't resonate with people, the money is not going to come in. Like, you can do the best marketing, but if the work that the organization's doing, as you said, isn't relevant or just isn't working anymore, it's not going to bring people in. So what do you do about that? So I think that's a time when you would need to step back, work with your key stakeholders, do some mission and visioning exercises and some strategic planning, and really try to think how and why is our work relevant now, and how have things changed over the past year, and what do we need to do in order to be relevant going forward. And that, I think, leads to oftentimes some very hard and honest conversations. But if you don't change, like, you have to change. Every organization has in some way, every institution, nobody has not been touched by COVID in the last year, right? It's at the most basic level, every single person in the world has been impacted, and every single organization, institution, school, everything has changed, and maybe not in significant ways, but I think you have to always be on the lookout for how the world around you informs your operations, and change your operations in order to remain relevant.
Yeah. I mean,
I think you just have to be honest about it. Like, it's not the same, things are not the same as they were, and they may not go back to being the same. And that's okay. Like, change is hard, but it's okay.
Yeah, change is hard. So tell us about like a success story, or an organization, whether it's an organization you worked with or something you've seen out in the world, where you think they've made this change in a really positive way, and you've seen the impact of their fundraising program.
Sure. So I worked with a client for about a year, where they wanted to build a sustainable major gifts program. They had not had a major gifts program, and had really just sort of had haphazard fundraising. So we spent a lot of time working with the board, looking at data, figuring out new ways to identify prospects, build prospect pipelines, put in place stewardship plans, sort of all of the core aspects of major gifts program. And I was running a number of those functions for a little while, and the volume got to be at a place where I said, I think you need a full-time major gifts officer to manage these functions. So they posted for a major gift officer and hired someone really good. And I think, certainly I'm a consultant, but I do not think you should have consultants running major gift running fundraising programs. I say that very publicly, and I say that to clients also. So I think when you get to the point where your operations are, consultant can get your operations up and running, bring someone in to run them full time and take it from there. So I was really proud of that project because I really helped them build a program and then turned it over to someone to take it forward into new heights.
That's great. And when I think about major gifts, I think about those who are like real, like philanthropic leaders in the community who want to step up and make a difference through philanthropy. But also, I also notice in speaking to many of our clients or organizations that I'm involved with, where there are a smaller and smaller number of donors at the top who are really like basically, funding the organization, whereas maybe the bottom 10% is of the funding, it comes from most of their donors. So I don't know, are you seeing that where like, a lot of organizations are kind of, I guess, in this pyramid, as you explained to me, where the number of donors at the very top is it's getting smaller and smaller. And is that sustainable, and how do organizations reverse that trend?
So it's definitely the case that there's a pyramid model. So there are a few donors at the top, and then it funnels down from there, and there are far more at the bottom giving lower dollar gifts. I think in the last year, the people at the top a lot has been asked of them. They've been asked to step up, to give more, to literally keep the doors open, keep operations going. And I think there is some donor fatigue up there. In an ideal organizational structure, you start at the bottom and you have a lot of folks who come in through digital engagement, people making gifts online. And then you build out a program to educate them, create connection with the organization, retain them. Certainly that's your area of expertise. But then you move them up the ladder of the pyramid. So hopefully you then move people from making a one-time gift to a monthly sustaining gift. Then there's outreach from a gift officer who solicits them for a larger annual gift. Then they're solicited year after year. They get to know the organization better. And then they populate the middle of the pyramid, which then becomes the pipeline for the top of the pyramid for the major gifts. So I think it's hard sometimes for organizations when they've gone to the same people at the top of the pyramid year after year, particularly in the last year, to sort of shift focus and think about the bottom. Like you're almost, in a sense, starting from scratch, but that's the only way you get new people in. And if you solicit online at whatever level, it means that you have the capacity to build out that bottom base of the pyramid. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a huge opportunity. I also see that organizations oftentimes neglect people in the middle. So there's a lot of time spent on digital, right? It's time consuming and it's hard to do it well, and it has to be done well if it's actually going to move donors into a pipeline. And there's a lot of time spent on people at the top, but there's a whole bucket of people in the middle. So maybe people who give $1,000 a year, $2,500 a year, $5,000 a year, who don't always get the attention that they need, which is missed opportunity because those people could be asked to give more year over year, and then they become the pipeline for the major donors at the top of the pyramid. So I think it takes a lot of strategy to keep all those balls in the air and to keep track of that cycle and that growth within the pyramid, but that's what you have to do in order to keep your pipeline fresh.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that middle area is often kind of missed, and certainly organizations don't want to lose them. But the question is, how do you keep a relationship going? How do you keep them engaged when you have limited resources or the number of people that can do the outreach? Have you seen anything in terms of like generational wealth, or like, do organizations need to be speaking differently or thinking differently about kind of the next generation of major gift philanthropists, mm-hmm. as the generation that's giving right now? And if so, like, what are you seeing or learning or hearing out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we're in the midst of a large transfer of wealth, and the World War II generation, the greatest generation, transferring wealth to their children who are, in their 50s and 60s at this point. And even people in that generation starting to engage their families. So I was going to say like younger people like us, but even much younger than us, looking at teenagers and college graduates. I think that philanthropists these days, so I think not everybody thinks about themselves as a philanthropist. And some people just want to give to organizations. They don't want all the fanfare that comes with giving. And so some of the old ways of recognizing and stewarding donors doesn't really fit for younger generations. So I think organizations need to be mindful of that. Some people don't necessarily want to be seen as wealthy. They want to be a little bit more behind the scenes. They want to have just a direct relationship with an organization's leader, and they don't necessarily need everybody calling them and thanking them and knowing about their wealth. There have been a couple of articles about that recently. I posted a couple on my own social media, just talking about how younger the generation to which wealth is being transferred don't necessarily think of themselves as philanthropists or want that same kind of treatment and structure as maybe their parents or grandparents did.
Mm-hmm.
I think generally younger people, and I would say, so that's like the next generation and down, want to see impact. So there, in some ways, there is less organizational affinity and more interest in launching projects that create the kind of impact that the donor wants to see. And there's a tension there at times between the donor and an organization, because oftentimes a donor may not actually know or have the skill set to know how to create impact. And sometimes the organization is not flexible or willing to take a risk to meet the donor where they are. So I think those conversations are very interesting. And if you can find an organization that's willing to stretch a bit and a donor that's willing to work within an established, successful framework, you really can create projects that are transformative and create a lot of impact in whatever area you're working in. But there's a bit of a misalignment at times. So I think generally having open lines of communication and open and honest conversation about what it is organizations are looking for and donors are looking for will help bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I imagine as a donor like that builds a relationship through a project that they then fund, it becomes an easier conversation with that donor about providing operational funds for the organization, or like getting them to understand the importance of also the organization having some, kind of general funding, right? Like to keep them going.
Yeah, I think you're talking about overhead, and I think overhead has had a very bad reputation in the past. But obviously, you need people in order to do work and accomplish goals and execute projects. And people are your most important capital. And obviously, people are not free, and there's a lot that needs to be provided in order to attract and sustain great people. There's been a bit of a shift in the institutional funding world with some of the larger foundations saying that they are more inclined than they have been in the past to offer general operating grants, which I think is very positive. It's not all of them, and it certainly isn't just like across the board. They've changed their policies, but I think conversations around operating funds and overhead are important because they are certainly top of mind for organizations. And there's only so much that you can put towards project work, right? Like people work and you need the people. And I think it's a really good question. And I see some trends, some positive trends, but I think we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. Where do you go to learn about, you mentioned different articles that you read and like trends reports, and like, are there people that you kind of follow or books you read or sites you visit? Where do you go to get to kind of keep your understanding, like kind of where the industry is?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I follow a lot of industry leaders online. So a lot of VPs of development at different types of organizations, just to see what they're thinking and feeling. And that helps me to keep my ear to the ground. I read the Chronicle of Philanthropy, philanthropy.com. I'm on a whole bunch of like aggregating lists that pull out, top stories about philanthropy and funders. I think it's called FeedSpot, which gives me a daily digest, which is helpful. And I follow online a lot of other consultants also to see what they're putting out there. And I read the the Business Journal, the Washington Business Journal, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. I set up keyword searches for fundraising and philanthropy, which does pull in a lot of stuff that's not necessarily what I want to read. But
Right.
I do need, since I work on my own and I'm not embedded in an organization the way I used to be, I definitely need to spend time keeping my ears to the ground and continuing to learn, to observe the trends. And I also talk about this with my clients all the time. Like I always ask, how's this going for you? What are you seeing? What are your peers and colleagues seeing? And that's helpful as well.
Yeah, interesting. So Stephanie, we're both Washingtonians, and it's living and working in this city is interesting at times. And every few years we have a cycle of a different kind of fundraising. So, political campaigns and PACs. Do you feel like that muddies the water a little bit with organizations that are looking to raise the important funds that they need and do the work and create the impact that they want to have? And do philanthropists kind of get distracted during those times when, because I don't know, we see it a lot because we live here, but I'm just wondering if you could share, like, do you see any trends in terms of like where politics and political campaigns kind of intercept or interrupt like organizational fundraising?
Yeah, I think they both intersect and interrupt, and it depends on the year, but I think we can certainly talk about 2016 through 2020 without getting overly political. Certainly that was a time that both in the election cycles, but also just throughout the Trump administration, that really drove a lot of organizational fundraising on social justice issues, racial inequality issues. And I think that's a really positive thing, right? Current events and certainly the politics of the day, I think should should impact people's thinking and their giving. I have mixed feelings about actual election cycles. I think some people, yes, are very busy and distracted, but that tends to be a small subset of people. Those are high-level political bundlers who are, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for candidates. That's a fairly small subset of the major gift population. I do think generally, and certainly in 2016 and 2020, like the average donor is distracted, right? Particularly, I think we can look to this fall, right? The news cycle was just out of control in terms of election coverage. And that is not always a helpful thing when you as an organization are trying to break through the noise. So it interrupts in that regard. But I think politics the state of our country will always intersect with philanthropy. So many organizations are impacted by social policies, by policies that a particular administration puts into place, as they should be. And I think it can both galvanize and disincentivize donors to participate.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think we'll wait and see what happens 2 years from now when we get into the next cycle. See if that has any impact. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining. I wanted to ask you one last question before we sign off, which is, you're working at home, you're a parent, you're a business owner, and you're working with many clients. Like, how do you stay inspired? And like, I don't know, is there something you do every day that's like something that like clears your mind or gets you to like step away from the work that you're doing? Because I imagine it can like kind of consume you. And a lot of fundraisers, especially, and consultants, like the work consumes you. And when you're working and living at home, it can be hard to like create the balance. I'm curious to know, like, I don't know, is there any mantra that you have or anything you want to share?
Sure. So I'm an early riser and I practice yoga almost every morning. And I have been practicing for probably 8 years, but have really stepped up my practice in the last 3 years. I practice almost every day. And I really feel like that time is critical to my mental and physical well-being and my ability to just sort of center myself and be able to focus on the day ahead.
That's really cool. When you say early riser, what are we talking like?
So I used to be a real early riser when I had to leave the house around 5. Wow. Now I'm more like 6, which to me doesn't really seem early, but when I talk to people. And when I'm trying to coordinate some group exercise classes, nobody wants to do it at like 6 or 6:30. So I'm usually up at 6 and do a daily yoga class between like 6:30 and 7:30, and then get started. It is nice not to have to commute. As you mentioned, I'm a parent. I have a small young boy at home. So he also has his routine has adapted. So he sleeps later now, which is nice because I get some extra time in the morning. But yes, daily yoga and coffee is very important to me.
That's great. I've got the coffee set. I'll have to work on the yoga.
Yes. And I bring the coffee
future.
to yoga, and it's in some ways the highlight of my day and like really a daily treat for me.
Sounds amazing. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom. If people want to learn more about you or your company, where should they go?
Sure. You can go to my website, which is littlebeangroup.com. And also follow me on LinkedIn. I have both the Little Bean Group page and my personal page where I post daily. So you can check out all my thoughts and insights on fundraising and work.
That's great. And I also subscribe to your email list, which people can
do have. Yes, you can do that from my website. And I do share a monthly newsletter with fundraising thoughts. And I've been branching out a bit into other things since it's been an interesting year. But yes, no spam, just monthly newsletter. So would love to have folks join.
It's great. Stephanie, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And we hope we'll see you again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Rally the Cause podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.